Jesus was a carpenter, and I don't think he would have made a bed for a gay couple. Jesus was a carpenter, and I don't think he would have made a bed for a gay couple. So two loving, committed adults just got engaged. They're excited. They're ecstatic. They are planning what will be, up to that point in their lives, the most memorable and important day. They are ready to commit their entire lives to each other, in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, in poverty and wealth. And they arrive at the bakery that they've selected to make their cake. They're going to taste some cake. They're going to look at some pictures of cake. And the owner greets them warmly. And they actually begin looking at photos of these beautiful custom cakes that have been designed. The owner, at some point, realizes that this isn't one friend helping another. This is actually a gay couple planning their own wedding. And the atmosphere immediately darkens. The owner becomes callous and disinterested. He informs them that he will not sell them one of the lovely cakes in the photos that they're looking at for their wedding. This bakery does not make cakes for gay customers. Why? Because Jesus was a carpenter, and I don't think he would have made a bed for a gay couple. Because God. The owner actually believed, and this is a quote, that God ordained marriage as the sacred union between one man and one woman, a union that exemplifies the relationship of Christ and his church. So the beautiful wedding cakes in those photos that they were looking at, they were reserved for the straight couples. The gay couple leaves the bakery, they're humiliated, they're hurt, they're marginalized. Now this is the gay wedding cake case. In about 1 month, on December 5th, the Supreme Court is going to hear arguments in Masterpiece Cake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. Because that gay couple eventually brought a complaint against the bakery under the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act. And this is one of the state's civil rights acts, one of 45 throughout the United States. And in its law, Colorado has decided to protect sexual orientation along with religion, national origin, and race. And the central question in the case is this: is God a license to discriminate? Put another way, does religious belief exempt the believer from the law? Does having a particular belief give someone the right to act on that belief just because the underlying belief is religious? So we're going to answer those questions tonight. Hopefully you'll begin to understand how dangerously seductive the arguments surrounding religious freedom truly are. But first, just a little bit about the Freedom from Religion Foundation for those of you who do not know it. This is where I work at FFRF. We are the watchers on what Thomas Jefferson called the wall of separation between church and state. Basically, I and all 9 attorneys at FFRF, including Chris here, we use our law degrees to stand up to religious bullies. Now, more often than not, those bullies occupy a government office, an office that belongs to we the people, and they are trying to use that office to promote their personal religion. And last year, our legal department got 5,000 complaints. Now, not all those were violations, most of them were, but 5,000 complaints. And they range from just about everything you could possibly imagine, from crosses on top of water towers, to Christian flags flying over city halls, to public schools distributing Bibles, to the IRS exempting, quote, ministers of the gospel from paying certain taxes. We actually just won that case in federal court the other day. To outright discrimination against atheists, to coaches and teachers telling their students and players that they have to pray. Now, first and foremost, we try to deal with these violations through education. We try to explain what the law says and what is required for these government entities to come back into compliance with the law. That's what we prefer. But we are willing to go to court. We will go to court. We have gone to court. And since the beginning of 2016, FFRF is 14-2. We have won or settled 14 cases in our favor and lost 2. And now that's where it stands right now. That could change. Some of the cases are on appeal, including the losses. So that number will probably change. But right now, 14-2. And actually, just in the past, I think 4 weeks, we've won 5 lawsuits. So at this moment, one of the biggest issues facing those of us who are defending the wall of separation is the definition of religious freedom. And to be a bit more precise, it's the attempt to redefine religious freedom. This last decade has seen a deliberate campaign to morph that individual right into a tool to impose on others. It is a deliberate attempt to weaponize religious freedom. In courts, you see it with decisions like the Hobby Lobby case. You see it in the state legislatures when they're trying to pass religious freedom laws, like the one that Mike Pence signed when he was governor of Indiana. And now you're seeing it at the Supreme Court with the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, the gay wedding cake case. And if that case comes out the way the bigoted baker wants, it will be a seismic shift in the way this nation has conceptualized religious freedom. Now, to understand the attempt to redefine this sacred right, we actually have to understand the history and the nature of it. The phrase wall of separation is not actually in the Constitution. Now, for some reason, this is something that our opponents think is the crowning argument against our position. And I could give an entire talk on why that's stupid, but I will just say that fair trial is not a phrase that appears in the Constitution. The presumption of innocent until proven guilty, those words do not appear in the Constitution. And everybody recognizes that we still have a right to those things. I'll also add that the word Christmas does not appear in the Bible, but they're still not afraid of saying that I constantly am warring against Christmas this time of year. So the phrase wall of separation isn't in the Constitution, but the American government and religion's relationship to that government begin and end with the Constitution. And our Constitution is godless. It conspicuously omits any mention of a deity or of Jesus. This is another unique contribution of our founders. And the original Constitution, the unamended Constitution, mentions religion only one time, in Article 6, Clause 3, which says that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Scholars have noted that this is one of the most clear, definite, and emphatic statements in a document that is full of hedging language. No, ever, any. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who wrote the first definitive legal commentaries on the Constitution, said that this clause was meant, quote, to cut off forever every pretense of any alliance between church and state in the national government. Now, for the founders, the absence of God in the Constitution and this emphatic amputation of every pretense was not enough. To further ensure that the government would not infringe the rights of citizens, something that was a big deal, feared by many during the fight to ratify the Constitution, the first Congress proposed some amendments, eventually giving us the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition their government for a redress of grievances. So that's 6 different rights. Okay? A secular government, the free exercise of religion, free speech, free press, free assembly, and petitioning your government. And they all have something in common. They all seek to protect the freedom of thought. And this is the one and only absolute right that you have under our Constitution. All our other rights can be curtailed and limited in certain circumstances, except the freedom of thought. Now, the protection for thought is embodied throughout the First Amendment in all 6 of those rights. It's also omnipresent in the American experiment. Right? It is one of those self-evident truths that the Declaration of Independence spoke of. So it's the one and only absolute right you have under the Constitution. Every other right can and should be limited in some certain circumstances. And that includes the free exercise of religion. And let's actually just take a minute and look closely at this language, because the free exercise clause prevents the government from prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Okay? It doesn't prevent the government from regulating conduct, religiously motivated or otherwise. Free exercise can be burdened. It can be encumbered, hampered, impeded, strained, hindered. It can even be obstructed. It just cannot be prohibited. So you could put this another way. What the First Amendment actually says is that the free exercise of religion can be regulated. It just can't be prohibited. And this is where the conflict arises. The conflict is between belief and action. People can believe whatever they like. They are free to believe that the voices that they're hearing are the voices of a God. They are free to believe that thetans and evil spirits are what make us sad. They're free to believe that the earth is a few thousand years old, or that a virgin can conceive a baby, or that whispering a few magic words over crackers and wine will turn them into flesh and blood. They're even free to believe that there was a guy named Jesus and that he was a carpenter and that he wouldn't have made a bed for a gay couple. But the right to act on those beliefs is not absolute. But some believers, including the credulous bakers, want to act out their faith in every area of their life, not just in church. And so we have this conflict, which means that we have to show that the right to act on your religious belief is not absolute, even though it's right there in the language of the First Amendment. And we can do this pretty easily. We'll do it with an example that is a little bit wild and a little bit obvious, and I'm choosing it because it's the example that the Supreme Court chose 150 years ago to prove this exact same point. Human sacrifice. Human sacrifice is actually pretty common in the Bible. The general Jephthah sacrifices his daughter, his only daughter, to thank God for helping him win a battle. Human sacrifice isn't just common in the Bible, it's actually the bedrock upon which Christianity is built. The world's most ubiquitous Bible verse, John 3:16, is about human sacrifice. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. This verse positively revels in human sacrifice. The story of Abraham, almost sacrificing his son Isaac, is often held up as the gold standard for how deep one's faith should be. But people who, like Abraham, hear a God telling them to kill their child do not have a right to do so. Religious freedom is completely irrelevant at that point. So somewhere on the spectrum of religiously motivated action, the civil law can clearly step in. The question is where? Where on that spectrum do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line when it comes to religiously motivated actions? Belief is absolute. Believe whatever you want, but actions are not absolute. So where would you draw that line between actions that are okay for the government to regulate and actions that aren't? Because the answer to that line drawing question is the answer to the question that we asked originally. Is God a license to discriminate? So Pope John Paul whipped himself to get closer to Jesus. That is not my cup of tea. You can feel free to self-flagellate all you want, mortify that flesh. But if you turn that whip on me, you can damn sure expect a fight. There's an old legal adage that says your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. Well, your right to swing your whip, or your rosary, or your Bible ends where my rights begin. And that's usually where we draw the line, where other people's rights begin. Thomas Jefferson put it like this. He said that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only. And only such actions are as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. But if religion mandates picking pockets or mandates breaking legs, then it's perfectly acceptable for the civil law to step in. And no belief, no matter how fervent, should change that. There is no religious right to infringe the rights of others. And for the most part, this is exactly where this country has drawn the line for more than 200 years. There was a 1944 Supreme Court case, and it said that the Supreme Court said that religion is not an excuse to violate child labor laws. In 1960, the televangelist Bob Jones declared in an Easter sermon that segregation was biblical. Quote, "If you are against segregation and against racial separation, then you are against God." He later went on to found Bob Jones University, which enjoyed a tax exemption and also discriminated against people of different races. So the IRS revoked that tax exemption, that privilege, because the school discriminated. Bob Jones University turned around and sued the federal government, the IRS, arguing that its religious beliefs required the discrimination and that the government couldn't remove that tax exemption, that privilege, because the discrimination was religiously motivated. The Supreme Court rejected that argument out of hand. Your religion doesn't allow you to violate the rights of others. That was in the 1980s. A little earlier, in the 1960s, a guy named Maurice Bessinger refused to let a minister's wife eat in his barbecue joint because she was black. He believed, quote, serving members of the Negro race would violate his sacred religious beliefs. He fought that all the way to the Supreme Court. He argued that the Civil Rights Act itself was invalid because it, quote, contravenes the will of God, and it interfered with his, quote, free exercise. The Supreme Court rejected this argument out of hand. They said that it was patently frivolous. It was not even a borderline case, according to them. No court involved in the case, anywhere along the line, countenanced the religiously motivated discrimination. There is no religious right to violate others' rights. That last case was called Piggy Park, and in it, that racist used religion to challenge the entire Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act and the state equivalents, including the law that the gay wedding cake case is being brought under, were enacted in part because black Americans could be denied meals and hotel rooms and gas. Their children could be denied entry into amusement parks, not just at one shop or at one motel or one park, but across an entire state or even an entire region. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote about this in his letter from the Birmingham jail. The letter, which is actually written to King's fellow clergymen, it speaks eloquently of the indignity of being denied service and treated as an inferior class. He wrote, "When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that she has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky. When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. We have these laws because without them, businesses could discriminate against people of different races, of different religions, of different nationalities. We have these laws because we are trying to secure for every American the promise that is carved into the words of our Supreme Court building, equal justice under law. And that brings us to a point that I've kind of ignored so far. So far, we've been talking about individual rights, the rights that you and I possess. By the laws of nature, these self-evident rights that every human being has simply by virtue of being human. Rights that are explained in and protected by our Constitution. But that's not what's happening in the gay wedding cake case. Masterpiece Cake Shop is not an individual asking for a right to discriminate. It's a business. The Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act only applies to places of public accommodation, to businesses. The bakery is a commercial entity. It only exists on paper. It's a legal fiction, and it wants to violate the rights of two human beings. So this case would not only redefine religious freedom to protect any religiously motivated action, no matter what its outcome or who it would affect, it would allow a commercial enterprise, which exists solely to sell a product and make money, to have a religious belief and act on that religious belief. This is nonsense. Or at least it was until the most recent wave of religious freedom laws and cases, which culminated in the Hobby Lobby decision. Now, this case was based on a federal law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and not the Constitution. Repeal that law, and the decision is gone. The gay wedding cake case is a claim that's based on the First Amendment, which makes it far more important because you can't repeal the First Amendment, and most people wouldn't want to. And also because unlike the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which only applies to the federal government and federal government action, the First Amendment also applies to the states. So any decision reinterpreting the First Amendment of the Constitution will be far more reaching than the Hobby Lobby case. But there's another question that we need to ask when it comes to religious freedom laws, like the one at issue in Hobby Lobby. We need to ask why. The First Amendment and the Constitution already protect religion. So why do we need religious freedom laws? Why do we need the Religious Freedom Restoration Act or 50 new state religious freedom laws to protect what is already so well protected by the Constitution? I actually just gave you the answer. It's because religious freedom is not a license to discriminate. It's not a license to violate the rights of others. But religious freedom laws are not about protecting religion. They are about privileging it. The goal is to redefine religious freedom. It's to shift from a standard that protects belief to one that allows that belief to be imposed on others. So the goal is to exempt religiously motivated acts from our laws. It's not enough to be able to believe. They insist on being able to act on that belief no matter what the impact on others. So that's the true purpose of religious freedom laws and the gay wedding cake case. It's simple. It's to privilege religion, to give it a special favored status, to give it the ability to impose on other citizens, to discriminate against other citizens. Those seeking to redefine religious freedom, they do not want protection. They want power. That is what the gay wedding case is really all about, redefining our rights under the Constitution to create a privileged class, to legalize discrimination and religious coercion. So 2 final points before we get to my favorite part, question and answers. So start thinking about your questions. First, if acting on these anti-religious beliefs is so important, if Hobby Lobby not providing birth control to employees, or a bakery not serving a gay couple is so important, then believers should be willing to violate the law. Believers ought to have the courage of their religious convictions and accept the consequences for their discrimination. They should stop expecting to bend our secular law to the will of their imaginary God. Second, the only way to guarantee the freedom of religion is with a government that is free from religion. True religious freedom cannot exist until we divorce the awesome power religion holds over the supposed afterlife from the power that the government has in everyday life. Until then, the true freedom of thought and even the freedom of religion cannot exist. So in short, a secular government is a prerequisite for religious freedom. That's why we, at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, say that the only wall we need is the wall that separates state and church. The wall of separation is an American original. It's an American invention. The idea was floating around in the ether of the Enlightenment, but it wasn't implemented until the American experiment. Until then, no other nation had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating the government from religion and religion from the government. America invented the separation of state and church, and I, for one, am pretty proud of that fact.